scared the hell out of me.
Definitely not what I intended.
The gaming industry is known for its incredibly diverse genres and the variety of environments and stories that it allows you to explore. Developers from all over the globe realize that people have different preferences and they don't enjoy the same thing, which pushes them to come up with new ideas to catch the attention of a certain demographic. However, if there's one genre that's notorious for being unstable, unpredictable, and very difficult to understand, it has to be the horror genre. For many developers and publishers, this genre is literally the riskiest in the entire business, and investing in it can be a sword with two edges. This sword can either help them slice their piece of the pie in a thriving market, or leave them with a permanent scar that forces them to turn the page and never come back. Realistically, no one really knows what games can succeed and whether the consumers would find a specific format of horror satisfying or not. And speaking of formats, it's very important to note that the horror genre itself is divided into various categories and branches. And according to most players, psychological horror specifically reigns supreme when it comes to being the scariest and the most intriguing. In fact, for them, it's the backbone of horror, because it relies heavily on messing with your mind and making you afraid of something that you don't necessarily see with your eyes, which is exactly how actual fear works. With that being said, the reason behind making this video is not to discuss why psychological horror games are terrifying, but it's actually about why people don't buy them, despite being personally fascinated by their concept. Why can someone enjoy watching long hours of content about a game but remain hesitant to play it themselves, even when they have the resources to do so? Well, to help you understand my point, I'm going to use two examples that I'm confident you're very familiar with. Resident Evil and Silent Hill are undoubtedly the most popular and recognizable horror franchises in gaming history, especially since both of them were born during the rise of 3D games, and they were among the first experiences to shape what modern horror looks like. We're talking about 1996 in the case of Resident Evil and 1999 with Silent Hill, a time when the genre in general was learning how to walk. What's even more fascinating is that the developers of both games had low expectations, and they didn't anticipate something big coming from them. But little did they know, Resident Evil became the best-selling PlayStation game at the time, and Silent Hill became a phenomenon for horror fans worldwide, because they felt that it was so scary without even trying. With Resident Evil, players were heavily impressed by the intense jump scares and horrifying fights with enemies, while with Silent Hill, they were blown away by how sound and atmosphere were enough to send chills down their spines. Now, if you focus on the terms I mentioned to describe how the games were received, you'll notice that I used the term best-selling to emphasize Resident Evil's success. But for Silent Hill, the word phenomenon was the most suitable. This is not a coincidence, because despite both titles being highlighted in the media in a similar fashion and being equally praised by players, the reality is that one of them was breaking records financially, while the other had a hard time converting the exposure into sales. Make no mistake, I'm not saying that Silent Hill did not sell a good number of copies, but if you compare it to Resident Evil, you'll sense a bizarre contrast that's not reflected in the popularity of both games.
How do you feel?
Oh, like I've been run over by a truck. But I'm alright, I guess.
For instance, Resident Evil on the PS1 sold 5.3 million copies, leading it to be the first horror game to ever reach this insane number. On the other hand, Silent Hill sold 2 million copies on the same platform. But the catch is that one of the reasons behind this impressive milestone is that many people bought it because they wanted something similar to Resident Evil 2, which was released 1 year prior in 1998. But once they played it and saw that it's unique and different, some players left the train, while others became obsessed with its story, narrative, and lore. Long story short, Resident Evil was clearly leading in the commercial field, but for a psychological horror experience, Silent Hill sold well enough to be a massive success for Konami. However, the issue is that the first Silent Hill was not the standard, and instead, it was actually the exception in the entire series. Many of the consumers who bought it were mostly curious and driven by expectations that were built by playing Resident Evil. So, after trying the game and understanding how the gameplay works, Silent Hill 1 became a turning point, and it divided the fans into two groups. On one side, you have gamers who genuinely enjoyed playing it and were eager for sequels. And on the other side, you have a much bigger crowd who didn't really have fun playing the game, but they still admire the plot and the exceptional lore. This is when the paths of the two franchises began to split, because after the first games, Resident Evil's sales were rising and rising, while Silent Hill's sequels were declining in the commercial department, one after the other. But even with this decline in sales, the crazy part is that Silent Hill's popularity was only getting bigger. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that the size of its fanbase is on the same level as Resident Evil's. I don't have time to make a comparison between all the games, but to summarize my point as best as I can, I'm going to focus on two special installments, which are Silent Hill 2 and Resident Evil 4. What many people don't know in the modern era is that when Silent Hill 2 was released in 2001, it wasn't seen as the iconic game you know today. In fact, if you check the reviews and comments from back then, you'll find that it was an actual disappointment to a huge number of fans. Not necessarily because of its quality, but mainly because the story was surprisingly different than anything they expected. Fans were asking three big questions. Where's Harry? Where's the cult? And who the heck is this guy, James? I'm not being sarcastic, because people at the time were seriously furious that the sequel was not related to the original game, and also that the narrative was much more ambiguous and slow. In other words, the psychology behind the horror in Silent Hill 2 was so sophisticated and profound that it literally became too complex for the average person, which eventually led many potential buyers to avoid it. This was so damaging for the sales, and even though it had a good start in the first month, it ended up selling less than the original game. In the next few years, the hardcore fans who played the game and loved it began to invade the gaming forums online so they can talk about their experience with it. As time passed, they started explaining the story for the public and simplifying the hidden details and the manifestations that regular players did not understand. This became a habit for people who saw the genius of Silent Hill 2, and subsequently, the conversations evolved into debates, speculations about secrets, and most importantly, theories. This is insane, because Silent Hill 2 was once a curse for the franchise due to its distinct storyline and fresh vision. But it somehow became a blessing over the years, because when the backstory and the lore were taught and simplified for the public, millions of people joined the community just to discuss the mysteries of Silent Hill 2.
Oh, it's you.
Yeah, I'm James.
Angela.
Angela. Okay.
So, despite the original game selling more copies, Silent Hill 2 ended up becoming more popular and more widespread. Not exactly because gamers wanted to play it, but because the psychological horror behind the characters and their puzzling lives was so attractive for everyone. In my opinion, Konami should really thank the veteran fans for the success of Silent Hill 2. The time and the effort that they put into piecing together the clues and sharing their ideas on the internet was far more powerful than any marketing campaign. Anyway, in summary, the journey that Silent Hill 2 went through to reach the historic prominence that it holds today was not an easy one. The fact that the horror inside it was masterfully implemented did not help it make more money, but it basically limited the number of people who could enjoy it and understand its logic. The typical gamers are not ready to squeeze their brains to find answers in this confusing world, and as a result, many of them simply gave up. If we go now to Resident Evil 4 and see how it was received in 2005, we'll find a completely different scenario. Not because it's the better game, but because it's more simple and fun. I don't want to waste time explaining it, but to keep it short, the gameplay alone was sufficient to make both reviewers and the players lose their minds from excitement. They did not need to think much about how deep the story is or if it's scary or not. The innovative camera perspective and the immersive combat were so effective in hooking anyone who touches the controller that everything else felt secondary. So as many of you already know, the game received amazing scores from all the media outlets on the planet, and it won so many awards on various occasions. Sales-wise, the game was printing money left and right, and as of today, it is estimated that it sold around 10 million copies, which is a gigantic number compared to the estimated 1.5 million copies that Silent Hill 2 sold. At this point, some of you might say that Silent Hill 2 did not have a fair chance because its popularity took years to grow, which makes it hard to compare it to Resident Evil 4 in the 2000s because the latter had the privilege of being the successor of several best-selling releases. Well, I agree with this take, and that's why I'm very happy that these two titles had another battle decades later in the 2020s, the era of the remakes. This time, I can safely say that the brand name of Silent Hill 2 is more recognizable than ever. And if you focus on the small signs of how popular the franchise in general is, you realize that Resident Evil is not really far away. For example, if you go to YouTube and search for videos that explain the timeline of both franchises, you will discover that the most viewed video for Resident Evil is this one, which has 8.1 million views in 3 years. Meanwhile, the most viewed video for Silent Hill comes from the same channel, and it has 7.5 million views in 4 years. This shows you that the populations of both fanbases on the internet, at least, are much closer than you think. Millions of people want to know what Resident Evil is all about, and at the same time, millions of people want to learn what happens in Silent Hill. Even if we go outside YouTube, we'll find this similar pattern, and the best example is the search volume of each title. Believe it or not, in the United States, the monthly volume is pretty much identical, with more than 165,000 searches for both titles. And globally, Resident Evil has the upper hand, but Silent Hill is not far behind. If we go deeper and investigate Google Trends to see the power of each brand during the crucial dates, we will witness a fascinating graph. During the release month of the Silent Hill 2 and Resident Evil 4 remakes, there was a huge spike in searches on both sides, and it's honestly stunning how close they are to each other. To put you into perspective, the yellow line here represents Dead Space Remake that was released shortly before them in 2023, and as you can see, it didn't even reach half of their buzz. This again proves that Silent Hill and Resident Evil are actual rivals when it comes to popularity and loyal fandoms. It's also apparent in the rankings that rely on people's votes, which explains why IGN readers voted Silent Hill 2 as the best horror game of all time, and Resident Evil 2 Remake came second. So, when we take all these references into account, it makes sense that when the Silent Hill 2 remake was revealed in 2022, the trailer had more than 11 million views, making it clear that there's an army of people who are excited about it. For anyone who is not familiar with the game and market, these numbers would be enough to convince them that the game in question is ready to sell millions and millions of copies. But strangely enough, this is not the case with Silent Hill 2. Despite the substantial improvements in visuals and mechanics, the remake has sold only 2.5 million copies to this day. And while this is an impressive number for a Silent Hill game, I can't help but wonder, where did all the other fans go? Why there are many millions of people who enjoy watching videos about the game, reading about the game, and discussing what happens in the game. But those same people don't want to open their wallets and buy the damn game. It's confusing, because when we look at what happened with Resident Evil 4 Remake, we see that it sold more than 11 million copies, very easily, and the number is going higher every day. For some reason, getting similar attention on the internet did not result in similar sales numbers, but it led to a bizarre equation in which one game is shining commercially while the other is barely making profit. What's even more ridiculous is that when we use RE6 for comparison, which is considered the worst installment ever, we find out that it sold more than 15 million. A number that's literally higher than the sales of the entire Silent Hill franchise. On paper, this difference between both franchises in the sales department seems unreasonable. But once you understand the psychology of humans and what drives consumers to buy a certain game, the pieces fall into place. One of the most outlandish aspects of Silent Hill 2 is that everyone loves the horror that it delivers. But when it comes to enjoying it firsthand, the target audience becomes much more limited. I previously mentioned that this problem is common among psychological horror games in general. But if we really want to describe what happens in Silent Hill 2 more precisely, the right term would be passive horror. Regardless of all the subgenres of horror that are out there, you need to keep in mind that most horror games are divided into two sectors. Those that rely on active horror and others that focus on passive horror. Active horror is when the threats in the game are direct, frequent, and designed to be in your face to scare you. This includes jump scares, stalkers, and intense missions that force you to run, hide, or fight. In this case, the horror is external, physical, and very visible, which means that it's intended to shock you or make you panic very quickly, without needing much context. On the flip side, the passive horror depends on a sustained atmosphere of dread that grows around you gradually and slowly, even when you don't see it with your eyes. The weapons of passive horror are not monsters, and it's definitely not jump scares. It's usually the silence, the seclusion, the emptiness, and the unbearable feeling of isolation that you can't explain. It's a style of horror in which the threat is the unknown, and nothing around you can be trusted. If you think about this in the context of Silent Hill 2, you'll start to understand why the scariest physical element here is always the town itself, and not really the monsters. The town of Silent Hill is by definition the main antagonist in the game, and your playthrough from start to finish is based on where the town wants to lead you. This type of horror is actually known as the most effective on the human mind. But the issue is that when you put it in a game, many people don't even see or understand it. And when a player doesn't see what really happens behind the scenes in Silent Hill, they start to feel that playing seems like a chore that they're forced to finish. For instance, very few people realize in their first session that the fog in the modern games is not moving randomly, but it actually serves as a guide that messes with your mind by pushing you to take certain routes. The thickness of the fog is being influenced by the town to drive your attention to something, which is a sign that the town is alive and is watching you all the time. And by the way, this is not a conclusion from my head. This was highlighted by the developers themselves in the physical guide of Silent Hill games, which confirmed that the fog is more profound than you assume.
Mary?
Nevertheless, even if someone understood how the place works, it's very hard for me to believe that an average player who bought the game for fun would be patient enough to focus on the symbolism behind the characters and enemies. The hardcore fans might think that investigating these details is enjoyable and that it would motivate anyone to explore every corner in the game. But in practice, this part is a pain in the butt for most people who play casually. This takes me to another turn-off for new players, which is the hidden fact that Silent Hill 2 was never meant to be fully understood in one playthrough. Objectively, it's pretty much impossible to see all the clues and secrets in your first experience, and this is basically a death sentence for the game in the eyes of casual gamers because they would never replay the whole thing when they didn't even enjoy it the first time. In the remake, there are some changes in the environment that I barely saw in my third playthrough, and the only reason I felt compelled to focus on everything is because I want to make videos about it, which is an incentive that the general public doesn't have. This is a photo in Brookhaven Hospital that I saw multiple times over and over. I saw the same nurses and I didn't notice anything suspicious in all those times, until I finally spotted by coincidence that Mary standing there. The power of this horrifying clue is that it was never meant to be in your face, and the only way you can have a chance of seeing it is when you visit the place at night, not in the afternoon with Maria. Another spine-chilling hint is the reflection of James on the glass. In the first playthrough, it's not easy to see that his head somehow turns into a pyramid, and this is disturbing evidence that Pyramid Head was always the manifestation of James's dark side. Anyway, the point here is that although this horror is enticing for everyone, the vast majority of people don't really want the struggle of finding it by themselves in a slow-paced experience. For them, the story, the town, and the characters are a source of fascination and mystery, but the gameplay is an obstacle standing in the way. So, from their perspective, the ultimate entertainment is when someone else deals with this obstacle and serves them the horror without the stress of facing it by themselves. This is when Silent Hill videos become a powerhouse of grabbing attention. Because for regular viewers, once you remove the burden of exploration, solving puzzles, and reading the documents, Silent Hill 2 becomes the best horror movie of all time. This is part of a human psychology because scientifically people's minds enjoy horror to the fullest when it happens passively and they're observing it from a safe position. Meanwhile, when they're inside the horror by themselves and confronting what comes from it, the enjoyment gets infested with pressure and stress. This makes sense because when a creator makes a Silent Hill video about the lore or theories, what you watch is the summary of their long journey, and they exclude hours and hours of stuff that you won't find interesting. These hours include walking around back and forth to avoid missing something, reading every document they grab to understand the history of a character or a building, and sometimes one puzzle can keep them stuck for an entire session. This explains why whenever the game is talked about, you can always see comments like Silent Hill 2 was never about gameplay, the combat is clunky because it's not the focus, and it was never designed to be fun, it's about the deep story. All these descriptions are factual, and they're viewed as positive by the Silent Hill community. But in the gaming market, they actually mean that the game won't easily push a casual gamer to grab the credit card and buy it. There's two reasons behind this. The first one is that the majority of gamers buy games that they find fun, replayable, and worthy of their time. And the second reason is that they don't really buy a lot of games to begin with. More than 60% of US players buy only 2 games in the whole year. And when I dug deeper, it became apparent to me that 5 games is basically the average across the board. Based on the popularity of genres, most people would probably buy multiple action games, which include RPGs and shooters. And they would also leave some money for a sports game like Madden or FIFA. So once the turn for a horror game comes, the budget is already tight, and the choices would be very narrow. In these situations, the gamers would ask themselves a very important question. Which game do I know for a fact that I want to play and I would enjoy from start to finish? This question is why Resident Evil always wins in the horror genre. It simply goes hand in hand with how the consumer thinks. The average player wants to buy a game with horror themes, but they also want to enjoy it. And this leads to a desire for a hybrid product in which horror and action are on the same screen. Regardless of whether you think modern Resident Evil is scary or not, it always succeeds in attracting customers from both the horror and the action crowds. The developers knew very well that it's impossible to achieve these insane numbers in sales without making the experience appealing for everyone, including those who don't like horror as a whole.
Now with me, we're gonna settle this!
That's why, from a gameplay perspective, Resident Evil is a game that practically anyone would be excited to try. It's visually stunning, rich with brutal fights, and most importantly, it remains playable even when you don't like the story. Long story short, it's the type of game that people of all ages and standards would buy without fear of keeping it in a dusty backlog. And by the way, if you want more evidence supporting the idea that people enjoy playing active horror while they prefer watching the passive one, Outlast is a great example. It's a terrifying horror game, but the reason so many gamers feel motivated to play it is because the horror is simple. It's not about the complicated story or the psychology of the protagonist, but it's all about running, hiding, and surviving the crazy enemies around you. This makes the experience a direct challenge for the player, which means it's easier for anyone to understand how the game works and the point of playing it. Believe it or not, my friend, it's estimated that Outlast sold more than 7 million copies over the years. And even though it's an indie game with a low budget, this number is higher than what Silent Hill 2, 3, and 4 sold combined. The contrast between Silent Hill's popularity and sales has been baffling for decades. But it really becomes much more logical when you realize that in the gaming world, we don't always buy the games that we love. This can also help you grasp why the new developers are trying to come up with new ideas and lean more toward action. Despite the size of its fanbase, realistically, Silent Hill can only grow by attracting a bigger portion from the casual audience over time. With that said, it's important to note that the recent financial performance of Silent Hill games is actually optimistic, and it's a huge improvement compared to the past. It's not up there with Resident Evil, but when you have a Silent Hill game selling almost 3 million in a year and another selling 1 million in a few days, it's an indication that many newcomers are giving the franchise a chance. Anyway, please like the video if you enjoyed it and leave your opinions in the comments below. See you next time.
Did you find the person that you were looking for?
Not yet.